All right, we're just gonna wait while people trickle in. So we'll just give it a minute. Thanks for joining, everyone. And we will start shortly. So just give it a little time. All right. So thanks for joining, everyone. I'm Representative Lindsay Doherty, and I am here with Senator Rachel Zenzinger and Representative Brianna Titone. And we are so happy to have Representative Julie McCluskie here for a budget update so that everyone knows where the money is going. So we're really excited about that. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Senator Zenzinger for her update.
Great. Welcome, everybody. I'm State Senator Rachel Zenzinger. I represent Senate District 19, which is Arvada and Westminster, all in Jefferson County. It has been a really busy couple of weeks. We're going to talk a little bit about what has been driving that busyness, which for me has been working on the state budget. The Joint Budget Committee successfully closed out the budget this week, and you're going to hear a little bit more from our guest speaker about what that all entails. But it has been a couple of really long days working on finalizing those details for our state spending for next year and making sure that we're able to cover all of our priorities. In the midst of that, I have had a couple of key bills that have made it across the finish line. I was very pleased to join the governor and a number of educational organizations to commemorate the signing of several bills that are going to work on addressing the teacher shortage, as well as a bill that is going to address online marketplace fraud and hopefully help us crack down on some retail crime that is occurring in our communities. So all of those bills were signed into law by the governor last week. In addition to that, I was very pleased yesterday. One of my signature bills passed successfully on third reading out of the state Senate, and that is for higher education support for foster youth. So that bill is now on its way to the House, and it was really exciting. It passed on a bipartisan vote, and it's going to be exciting because it's going to provide a number of tuition and educational supports for our youth that are exiting the foster care system so that they can obtain post-secondary education and pursue their dreams. In addition to that, a couple of my other housing bills were introduced last week and assigned to committee. So I will be sponsoring two key bills that came out of the Transformational Housing Task Force. The first of which is a middle income bill that will be focused on a CHAFA program. That will be in committee this coming Tuesday. And then the following Tuesday, I will be sponsoring a bill that will focus on a revolving loan fund for new construction for housing. So both of those initiatives were ranked very high on the final task force report. And I'm excited that I'm going to be able to sponsor those bills and take them to committee in the next 2 weeks. Lastly, I'll just end on, I have approximately 32 bills that are in the mix right now, not counting the Joint Budget Committee bills. Those will be coming up a little bit later. And if you would like to view those, I list all of the ones that are in the mix on my newsletter, and then I have them all posted on my website as well. To sign up for my newsletter and to view those bills, just go to rachelforcolorado.com and click on the links at the top, and those will get you to those lists. I'm really excited to be here today and to share the time with my colleague in the Joint Budget Committee. I think it's going to be a really exciting presentation. And with that, I'm going to kick things over to Representative Titone for her update.
All right. Well, thank you, Senator Zenzinger. And sorry, I am on location in another event this morning. So I just want to make sure I joined you to tell you what I've been up to here at the Capitol. So I've had a whole bunch of different bills. Some of them you may have seen on the news recently. One of the bills was around sex worker safe reporting. So if someone is working in sex work or is a sex trafficking victim, they are an assault victim, they can have the courage and the ability to report that crime. So it's really about putting the violent criminals behind bars, as people that have been getting away with preying on people for a long time. So that's 1288. We also recently just passed on third reading House Bill 1157. That was a bill for demographic data. We're trying to collect more data voluntarily from people to address health disparities, so we can find out how different communities, especially minority communities, are falling through the cracks in a lot of our health areas. So that bill passed third reading. I'll be going over the Senate. Also passed two bills out of committee. They're bills that go together on wheelchair repair. So one of them is House Bill 1031. House Bill 1031 is the right to repair. Senator Zenzinger is one of the Senate sponsors on that one. And that one allows people who are not on Medicaid, anyone who is in private pay or private insurance, to be able to fix their own stuff. So they can have the ability to get the parts and diagrams and tools that they need to be able to fix their wheelchairs, because it's a very important issue. And anytime anyone has a delay in getting their wheelchair repaired, that causes more harm to them, and it causes a lot of inconvenience. The other bill that's a companion bill is 1290 that passed also out of committee. We're waiting for appropriations probably after the budget. The budget is called a long bill. You'll learn about that later. And that bill is focusing on Medicaid. So anyone who is in a motorized wheelchair and they get their wheelchair from Medicaid, this is going to help streamline the process for them to be able to get their wheelchair fixed. I have two other bills that are coming up. One of them just got introduced. That is the care coordination for behavioral health. So we're implementing some technology fixes to help with care coordination for behavioral health. That one is the Senate Bill 177. So it just got introduced yesterday. Another bill that's going to be coming soon is a continuation of the Climber loan program. And that's an initiative out of the Treasurer's Office to give people loans for small businesses. It was very, very, very successful. So we're going to be continuing that, making some changes, expanding that out to people to get access to small business loans. So it's a really, really good bill. Unfortunately, my HOA Community Association Manager licensing bill was killed in committee last week. So that was very sad. I worked hard on that one to try to come up with a different solution, and didn't end up panning out. That one was House Bill 1239. If anybody has any questions about that, please do send me an email about that bill. There's still a few other bills that are still coming in the system later on. I have a bunch of late bills that haven't been introduced yet. So lots of things happening. If you get my newsletter, you'll be updated on all of these things in great detail. So I do encourage you to go to my website, briannaforco.com, and click on the Get Involved link on the top. And you can get my newsletter, and it's really good, and you'll learn lots about what's happening in the Capitol. Not only just my bills, but some of the other bills that have been going on. This latest issue, we're talking about all of the disability related bills, and there's a whole bunch of them. And that is in part because of Representative Ortiz, who is the first legislator in the House who in a wheelchair and has been really passionate about those issues and has really been taking those up in a lot more, speaking to power on those issues. So we're really grateful to have him, and he got to chair the committee of the whole for the first time on Thursday. So that was a historic moment for what we do on the House floor. So I encourage you to get on my newsletter, send me an email. I'll put the stuff in the chat before I head out. But I wanted to say thank you for joining us again, and hope you learn lots about the budget, because we're about to get real knee deep, neck deep into the budget this week. And we'll have you more to report on it when that whole process is done. So thanks very much, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you, Representative Tatone. And yes, this week is budget week, which is why we are talking about the budget, and it's so timely. So I'll just do a brief overview of things I've been working on and give you some updates on where the status of some of my bills are. So the Right to Counsel for Youth bill fortunately passed through the Senate. That one changed the standard from the hybrid model of attorney representation for abused and neglected youth to a purely client-directed model. It's a big change in the guardian ad litem world, but that one, great bill, had great testimony, passed through both houses, and now we are waiting for that bill to be signed into law with the governor. So I'm very excited about that one. My Youth Delinquency Prevention and Intervention Grants bill will now be in the Senate Judiciary Committee, I believe next week. So that one I'm very excited as well, as I always try to focus on doing what we can for our youth in order to provide the most opportunities for them as possible. I had a jury postponement for out-of-state students pass through the Senate, I believe, this week. That one is bipartisan bill. I did with Representative Bockenfeld, who we had heard from some college students that are out of state, that it was very hard for them to get back for jury duty. And so we want everyone to have the opportunity to do it, but we notice that sometimes it's a little bit harder for our out-of-state students. So that one just allows, but not mandates, the court discretion to increase the time for postponement for out-of-state students. I have the sales and tax use refunds that went through committee on the House side. That one will be in the Senate next week in the Finance Committee. And that was my first tax bill. I learned a lot about tax law. I don't do tax law, I do people law. So it might be my last tax bill. If you know there are some very passionate accountants out there that really dug into the issue. So we did a lot of stakeholding on this bill that I wasn't anticipating all of the nuanced issues, but I certainly learned a lot, and we had a very robust discussion in Finance Committee as well. So yeah, that one learned a lot, but I think that's a really good bill for businesses and for the agency, because what we were seeing is that we were getting so many claims fraudulently or frivolously that it was really impacting the people who are submitting honest claims and getting their refunds. So essentially, it incentivized the state to pay out tax refunds more quickly. It also saves money for the state of Colorado by reducing the amount of interest it has to pay out. So again, it cuts down on the number of frivolous claims that are currently slowing down the system. So happy to do that bill. Like I said, might be my last tax bill. And then I just wanted to quickly go over, I've got two new ones coming out. One has already been introduced, the other should be introduced next week. One has to do with the work comp system. So I've done a little bit of workers' compensation law. And I think, there are a lot of clarities and ways we can improve the system for both sides, the injured worker and the employers. And so that's what I've been trying to do with all these workers' compensation bills that I've been running. This next one is a negotiated bill between business and plaintiffs and injured workers. And what it does is it basically modernizes the system. So for example, funeral benefits for workers haven't been increased since '94. And so we're just updating those nuances and making sure that it's a more fair and just system. So that one should come out soon. And then I have another one that was just introduced. And this one has to do with medical records requests. So right now, going back, there was some legislation. It was federal legislation, and it was called the High-Tech Act. And what it did is it gave a lot of money to hospitals to modernize their systems on how they give patients and injured people records. That included attorneys. So if you're an injured person, you've had a traumatic brain injury, you've been in, that involves nursing home neglect cases, anything like that. It involved attorneys that could request records for you under this negotiated high-tech rate. So there was a case in federal court last year that stated that attorneys now, there's some gray area whether attorneys fall into this category under high tech. And so what we're seeing is people having to pay thousands and thousands of dollars for their medical records. And so what this is doing is it's making sure that we're adding a definition of authorized personal representative to ensure that this includes an attorney working on behalf of an individual seeking copies of their medical records. And why that's important is, for example, I'll give you a personal example. A few years ago when we had high tech and we hadn't had any federal legislation to the contrary yet, I had a nursing home neglect case I was working on. Terrible, terrible things had happened to this poor individual, and we were requesting records on his behalf. He could not request these records himself because he was injured. $6,000 was the bill I got. It took me 2 days on the phone, lots of back and forth, lots of case law dealing with high tech. I got it down to $6.50. So anyway, we're trying to make it go back to that standard where people aren't paying thousands and thousands of dollars for these records because it's really just not fair. So I'm very passionate about that one, and I will stop there. And I will kick it back to Senator Zenzinger to introduce our guest. Thanks.
So I am the Senate sponsor of that bill, and I just learned something. So thank you for explaining it. So we could probably fill up the entire time period today with updates, but we are very excited to be able to pass the torch over to our guest speaker, Representative Julie McCluskie, who is going to dig in a little bit and talk about our budget proposal for next year. Representative McCluskie was first elected state representative for House District 61 back in 2018 and was re-elected in 2020. And according to her, represents 5 of the most beautiful counties in Colorado's Rocky Mountains and along the western slope. Those counties include Summit, Lake, Delta, Gunnison, and Pitkin. In her first legislative session, she was appointed to serve on the Rural Affairs and Agricultural Committee, Education Committee, and the Appropriations Committee. And most notably, she was honored to receive an appointment to the prestigious 6-person Joint Budget Committee in January of 2020. And she is now the chair of the Joint Budget Committee as of this year. And as a personal note, I will tell you that she was a fantastic chairperson. If you've never been on the Joint Budget Committee, which is the majority of the legislature, I don't think most people or most legislators understand all of the responsibility that falls on the chair of the Joint Budget Committee. It is a lot, and Julie was just remarkable in her first stint as chair of the Joint Budget Committee. So among her legislative accomplishments include passing a statewide reinsurance program, which really helped to bring down the health insurance premiums on individuals in the marketplace. 30%, quite frankly, on the western slope. Numerous education bills, including a renewal of the READ Act, establishing a statewide concurrent enrollment access program, and we joined up together in creating the new higher education funding formula. She also did the bill that referred the nicotine tax to the 2020 ballot measure that did help provide new funding for rural schools, the state education fund, and ultimately an expansion of the early childhood education program statewide. And this session, she brought $48 million to affordable housing grants, nearly $200 million more to public schools, colleges and universities, and over $100 million to the wildfire mitigation and suppression programs. So lots of good stuff that Representative McCluskie has sponsored, and good stuff for our state. So with that, I'm very excited to be able to turn the program over. We are going to do some screen sharing here so that Representative McCluskie can share her PowerPoint with everybody about the budget. And with that, take it away. Oh, I am so sorry. Before I pass it over, I just want to point out a couple of things. We do have the chat function, but more importantly, we have the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. So if during the presentation you have a question about something, go ahead and throw your question into the Q&A, and Rep. Doherty and myself will work on addressing those questions. And if it seems timely, we may interrupt Rep. McCluskie to ask your question if it's related to something in the PowerPoint. We will definitely have time at the end of the presentation to address questions, and we will do our best to accommodate that. So now I am pleased to be able to turn things over to Rep. McCluskie.
Wow, Senator Zenzinger, thank you so much. I am just delighted to be here, and I want to give both you and Representative Doherty and Representative Titone my gratitude, and also what a privilege it is to serve with the three of you. You do such an amazing job representing the people in your districts. Certainly, you bring great passion to the jobs that we are all engaged in, trying to make Colorado a better, brighter place after a rough global pandemic and economic crisis. And just sitting here listening to the three of you, I am really impressed and so proud of the great work that you're doing to serve Coloradans during this time. So thank you all. I am going to move to share my screen and be able to update all of you. Hope you can see that. Provide an overview of where we're at with Colorado's budget. As Senator Zenzinger said, it has been a very busy 5 months as we have worked to bring forward a budget that reflects Colorado's values, invests in the needs of the people that we serve, and really helps to fuel the great Colorado comeback. When we talk about the work we're doing this year, I have to reflect on our accomplishments from last year. As many people will remember, when the pandemic hit in March of 2020, the Budget Committee made a number of significant reductions. Nearly 25% of our budget, more than $3 billion, was taken out of our budget so that we could ensure Colorado stayed on safe and responsible fiscal footing. Last year, because we saw Colorado come back stronger than we had anticipated, we didn't feel the impacts of the pandemic in quite the way we had anticipated. We were able to make some very smart investments. Everything from startup loan funds for businesses, putting money into affordable housing, incentives and initiatives. As Senator Zenzinger mentioned, wildfire mitigation, preparedness and response, making sure that we were protecting our artists, arts and culture organizations, and certainly hitting on some of the other needs that we have as a state to ensure that working people can stay employed, continue to thrive and live with the jobs that pay a living wage. So investing in childcare, making sure that our workforce was on stable footing, and providing more opportunities for economic development in all parts of our state. This year, as we face our legislative session, we are making some extraordinary investments in affordable housing, behavioral and mental health, reform services and programs. We're putting money into workforce talent pipelines, collaborative initiatives, making sure, Senator Zenzinger carrying one of these bills, making sure that workers can really leverage their school, their workplace learning into stackable credentials that will help them gain better paying jobs. We're also putting a lot of money into different economic recovery and relief efforts. That includes services and programs for low-income families, those families hit hardest by the pandemic, again, childcare, education, and certainly water and wildfire. I want to share with all of you a few of the updates we received just last week on where we are with our economy here in the state. While we really did experience a significant number of layoffs during the very start of the pandemic, Colorado has bounced back well and quickly. This isn't like the Great Recession of 2008 that took us 4 or 5 years to climb out of. Really, we've rebounded. We're almost back to the same unemployment rate that we were in March of 2020. And I think as we look forward, we're seeing a lot of upside in our economy's return to the path that it was on before the pandemic. Whoops. And of course, my slides froze up. What is hampering our recovery, though, is a significant increase in inflation. And, this really has to do with a number of factors outside of what we've been doing in state government. As so many of us are aware, the supply chain for products and services has been deeply impacted by the shutdown of so many economies worldwide. That supply chain interruption has created increased costs. And you can see from this particular chart, we're seeing those costs really explode in transportation, of course, energy costs, housing, and then the costs and impacts to our medical services. We look now kind of at, so what happens in the next few years for our state? What can we anticipate in general fund revenue? And general fund is really the operating dollars that we use as a state to provide all of the services and programs and education and healthcare that the state provides for its citizens. We do see ongoing growth, but as you'll see from this slide, our referendum C cap or our Tabor cap is coming into play, and that limits the amount of money that we can invest in education, in Medicaid, in a lot of those services and programs that we provide for the most vulnerable citizens in our state. Over the next few years, we do anticipate Tabor refunds to our citizens. That certainly is a good thing for people to receive some of their taxes back. But it is part of the reason why we can't invest more in our public schools, our colleges, our universities, and some of the other programs that I mentioned earlier. Most of the money in the state's operating budget goes to these big six, the 6 departments where so much of our funding provides services to people, education being the largest. And that's really our public schools, not our colleges and universities. Most of our funding in the state's operating budget goes to provide the dollars that that pay teachers their salaries and everyone else who delivers that high quality public education program for our kids. It also goes into, classrooms and the curriculum, the professional development, all of the necessary ingredients for school learning. We also put a great deal of money into Medicaid. We saw an explosion in Medicaid enrollment, as one would expect during a pandemic. We continue to receive additional support from the federal government to make sure that people can stay on Medicaid during this time. We anticipate that next year, the public health emergency will end. And when it does, that will be a time for people currently on Medicaid to move off. We certainly don't want to see people lose that benefit, but the extended supports through this particular time do end. And then we hope that through a lot of county support, we're able to help people get onto the individual marketplace, still securing health insurance for themselves and their families, but doing so in a way that doesn't place an unnecessary burden on the state. Higher education certainly takes a chunk out of the state budget, human services, corrections, and judicial as well. And this may be the best slide of all, and I will invite Senator Zenzinger, who does an exceptional job serving on the Joint Budget Committee, to join me in highlighting what we are bringing forward in this year's budget. I think one of our headlines is that we continue to recognize the risk that the state is facing. While we may be through two very concerning strains of the virus, the Delta and Omicron developments with the COVID-19 pandemic, we still want to be prepared if there are additional threats from COVID-19 variants or other changes that come from the pandemic. So we have really invested in making sure our general fund reserves are adequate to protect the state from another economic downturn or additional needs in response to the pandemic. This year, we are providing an across-the-board pay increase for all state employees for up to 3%, and making sure that every employee in the state is earning at least a $15 minimum wage. I am super proud and really love to highlight that Senator Zenzinger is the chair of the Senate Education Committee. Together, we've been able to buy down the budget stabilization factor by $250 million, adding yet another $80 million to special education funding in this state. We've also, I think, exceeded all expectations and have been able to put a new $129 million to our colleges and our universities, really protecting our college students, making sure that they aren't experiencing extraordinary increases in tuition during this time. And we've put aside a significant amount of one-time funding so that our partners in the legislature can invest in those ongoing needs as we recover and come out of the pandemic. Relief for individuals and small businesses, investing in public safety, air quality, workforce development, and certainly continuing to save Coloradans money by providing fee relief so that everybody has a chance to get back on their feet. And just love to highlight some of the other areas where we have put additional funding to our family resource centers, our community providers, a lot of our nursing facilities, making sure that they are able to keep their doors open during this tough time, investments in our school nurse grant program, youth services, higher ed capital. Special shout out to Representative Titone, who is the chair of the IT Capital Committee and who helped us see where we could make strategic investments in IT this year, and just so much more. And Senator Zenzinger, certainly if you want to highlight or add any other additions to our budget this year.
So I get a lot of questions about things like transportation funding or funding for our parks and wildlife. You saw on that slide there that Rep. McCluskie put on, it's a couple slides back, that kind of shows you what our big six are. I don't know if we could go back to that slide very quickly.
Let me see if I can get there.
So at the bottom of that list, we have that other category down there at the bottom. So the majority of our general fund dollars within our budget go towards education. The second largest component of our budget goes to healthcare policy and financing. That is mostly the Medicaid system. Then the remaining amounts, which are very small components of the budget, but still big, would be higher education, human services, in addition to our child welfare system, also includes things like the Office of Behavioral Health and some of those types of initiatives. Then corrections, judicial, we did make some pretty significant investments into judicial, but then all areas of our budget fall into that other category, such as things like transportation. Now, the majority of our transportation funding is actually not out of the general fund. So there's only a very, 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 very small, minute slice of transportation funding that comes out of the general fund. Last year was an exception because last year we passed a comprehensive transportation bill that did use a significant amount of general fund dollars for transportation purposes. I can't even remember the total amount, but I think when all is said and done, it was going to be $500 million from the general fund, not in all in one year, but over the course of, I think, the next 5 years. So if you had any interests that kind of fall into other areas of state government, they're probably going to fall into that other component. It doesn't mean, however, that those other areas are not receiving funding. What it means is that they're probably receiving funding from different funding sources. So it's possible that they are primarily funded by fees. So one of those examples would be the Department of Regulatory Agencies. It is not really funded out of the general fund, except for the worker component, the full-time employee component, and their benefits. But the programming that the Department of Regulatory Agencies does is mostly funded through fees that support those functionings, so cash funds. However, cash funds do count towards our Tabor spending limit, the same as our general fund spending does. So those cash funded programs do end up impacting our Tabor cap and the amount of money in which we are currently over that Tabor cap that would be ultimately refunded back to the citizens. Other types of departments may have federal funds. So we do have a state Veterans and Military Affairs Department, but the majority of that department and the programs fall under federal funding. And so the general fund component is quite small. So I think this year we really looked at, last year was all about recovery and putting back money into the areas that we cut in 2020 because of the pandemic. So last year was really about how can we get back to where we were in 2020. This year was how can we look at recovering from the other impacts of the pandemic and what they had in our society at large. So really looking at those items that Rep. McCluskie called out at the beginning of her presentation. I don't have much more to add other than I want to point out that the improvements that we made towards education funding this year really are significant. Just 2 years ago, we were at over $1 billion for the budget stabilization factor, which is an IOU that we offer up to the schools and the school districts. After we complete the School Finance Act funding formula, we get an amount of money that is going to be the state's share that we contribute towards education that is coupled with the local share. And when we get to that final number, we subtract a percentage of that funding, and that percentage of funding that is subtracted is known as the budget stabilization factor. The amount that we were subtracting 2 years ago was over $1 billion. And we are really excited that as of now, in next year's budget, we're going to be able to drive that down into the mid 350s. So incrementally, we've been buying it down and buying it down and buying it down, and we are within, I think, striking distance of completely eliminating the budget stabilization factor next year. But we were unable to do that this year without risking having to just turn around and increase it the following year. And we don't want to do that. We really believe that it's important that we make sure our funding is stable, predictable, so that our school districts can go ahead and hire the faculty, hire the educators that they need in order to educate our kids. And if we were to completely eliminate the budget stabilization factor this year, we would just have to turn around and raise it again the following year. So we wanted to be mindful of that, and we wanted to have a really nice predictable decline in that budget stabilization factor so that we can have and return full funding to education. And I'll stop on that.
Thank you, Senator Zenzinger. I am, so proud of the work we've done. I should highlight that next steps include starting Monday in the House of Representatives, bringing this budget forward and moving it through our conversations with our colleagues and hopefully gaining their support so that we can then send the budget over to the Senate. Once the budget gets through the Senate, it heads to the governor's desk for signature, and then we can look forward to seeing these dollars become, the fuel that really drives that Colorado comeback for all of us this next year. I am happy to take any additional questions and just want to thank you all for this great opportunity to say hello and check in on the work down at the Capitol.
Well, thank you so much for the presentation. We do have some questions that have stacked up in the Q&A, and I just want to remind folks that if you did have any questions about the budget for next year, that would be the appropriate place to put them in. And our first question comes from Kathy Smith, and she wants to know, how will people be able to keep their Medicaid if they need to after the emergency is over? And I know that the whole question about Medicaid benefits and the expansion of Medicaid benefits prior to the pandemic, and then the additional expansion that we had during the pandemic in order to ensure that people that lost their jobs, for example, could continue to receive health care. Things like that, that was a central part of our budgeting this year. So maybe if you could talk about that Medicaid process and the question about what do people do if they need to after the emergency is declared over, and what those impacts will be to our budget.
A great question. Thank you, Kathy. As I said, as long as the public health emergency is in play, we will not be disenrolling anyone from Medicaid. Those benefits continue regardless of an individual or a family's income level. Once the public health emergency is resolved, that it stops, then we are adding money to county administration so that they have the capacity to help individuals transition if they are now earning an income that disqualifies them from Medicaid. Our county administration and county services will be able to help people transition to the individual marketplace if that is where they want to go in order to secure a private health insurance plan. I know many of our family resource centers and other local nonprofits help assist in navigating those choices in health insurance and helping people secure health insurance for themselves and their families. I do think that the window of time, I believe everyone has 60 days following the end of that public health emergency. I know our counties would have that exact number, but it does give everyone at least a little bit of time. They'll be notified if they need to reevaluate their whether they qualify for Medicaid or not. We also have CHP Plus, which is the children's health insurance program that people can qualify for if they are earning too much to qualify for Medicaid. So there is a bit of a bridge program with CHP Plus. That's a great way for our children to continue to have health insurance. particularly if a family is struggling to get back on their feet. And I anticipate that the state will continue its march in trying to bring down the cost of health insurance on the individual marketplace, as we've already done with reinsurance and now with the new Colorado option. So I hope there are plenty of choices for people as we get through the public health crisis.
Great. Thank you so much for the clarification there. And there's another question in the chat regarding preschool. And we know you're very knowledgeable of preschool in general regarding the whole budget. So we'd love to hear generally about preschool. And then also the specific question is the 34.3% for education inclusive of preschool? So I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Rep. Doherty. This is a great question. And when Proposition EE passed overwhelmingly by Colorado voters, I think there was a lot of cheering about how exciting it will be for every single 4-year-old in the state to have a minimum of 10 free hours of preschool. We love that is now a part of what the state is working on. And it takes a lot to stand up a statewide universal preschool program. We are right now working on a particular bill. It just passed through the House and is headed to the Senate, creating a Department of Early Childhood. We currently have a smaller Office of Early Childhood in the Department of Human Services, but we are expanding that department. We are creating a new department, expanding it to be able to put the infrastructure into place, including the funding, so that all 4-year-olds in the state have access to some amount of preschool. Low-income families, we hope, having a fully funded preschool program for their children. I think the specific question about the cost, it doesn't really belong in the K-12 or the public school funding. We do provide CPP slots, Colorado Preschool Program slots, through the school finance formula. But this new universal preschool program will include other funding streams. The funding streams that we created through the nicotine tax that Proposition EE proposed. So the dollars that flow into universal preschool will not show up until next year, the FY24. Our fiscal year is July through June. So the July 23 through June of 24 budget, that's when you'll see the universal preschool dollars start to flow to families through the building of the program in our Department of Early Childhood. So those dollars are not in this year's budget, but you'll see them in the year ahead.
And thank you for explaining process of establishing this new department. It was kind of an unusual budget year to do that. Ordinarily, we receive presentations from all of the different divisions. They come and executive staff will talk about their priorities and how their departments work and what they spend on. And then they offer up their budget priorities, things that they would like us to consider in next year's budget. And it was a little awkward this year because the new department is just getting off the ground. So there was some juggling, trying to predict about what they would need and how much it would cost. And it's a brand new line item and a brand new division within our state budget. But it is really exciting to be able to be there. And I believe it'll be our last allowable division under our Constitution, because I think we are capped at 23 divisions, which I think this will become the 23rd division. So part of that work was transitioning all of the different early childhood programming that lived in other areas of the budget within other divisions and pulling them all together under one umbrella. And then certainly the universal preschool program is a part of that work. But we are excited that we are able to do that in the state, because we think it'll offer up a much better streamlined focus on that early childhood experience, because right now, the type of programming that is affiliated with early childhood is across many different divisions in the state. And so it makes it very challenging for parents and for families to navigate that system. So thank you for explaining the background on that and the connection. We don't have any more questions in the chat, so I wanted to offer up a question for you, and it's somewhat personal. Is there an area of the budget that you had a particular interest in this year that you would like to talk about? Something that we did that came up through the budget discussions that you had a particular keen interest in that you would like to highlight? Perhaps something that doesn't necessarily make the talking points list, right?
I love that question, Senator Zenzinger. Thank you. You know, there's probably a couple of areas. I have to say, I spent years in Summit County School District working for schools here. And I also worked for Lieutenant Governor Joe Garcia when he was executive director of the Department of Higher Ed. So everything in education is a priority of mine, and I believe a priority of our state. I love spending the time to figure out how we can drive more dollars to student success. And one of the small things we did this year that I think deserves a bit of a spotlight is that we, for the first time, have created an individual to serve as the liaison with our tribes, the recognized tribes in Colorado, to better serve our Native American students. We have not had that capacity in the Department of Education, and I'm really proud that this year we took the time to create a position, make sure that our tribes down in Southwest Colorado and all Native American students across the state receive the type of support and focus, whether it comes to curriculum or special services, that they all deserve. So I think that was a great win for us in our budget. I'm also very proud of the focus that we continue to carry around Colorado's beautiful environment and our pristine landscapes. You know, the wildfires these past few years have been absolutely devastating. And one of the needs that came to our attention this year is that so many of our smaller communities and volunteer firefighting departments simply don't have the resources to make sure that firefighters have protective gear in a moment when they have to fight a fire. We heard from one fire department that has equipment that's more than 2 decades old, and much of it is held together with duct tape. So we put $5 million into protective equipment, particularly for those smaller fire departments in the state and for our volunteer firefighters. And that was certainly a feel-good moment when we could send that money out to those who are battling wildfires for all of us.
Great. And I actually have a question for both of you on the budget, since you are both involved. I just want everyone to know that this is a lot of work. And so I'm so thankful for the two of you for doing the work. It's such long hours. It's tough. It's a tough thing to do. And so just thank you. I don't know if a lot of people realize how much work it is. So my question for both of you would be, what, this year, or I guess in years past, or generally, what is the toughest thing about this process? So I'll just turn it over to you.
Senator Zenzinger, you go first.
No, I was going to say you go first.
Rep. Doherty, wow, that is the question. And I will tell you, this last week, when we have so many priorities in this state, when we long to completely pay off the budget stabilization factor, when we want to make sure that Colorado moves from 48th in funding higher education to at least a median, an average amount compared to the 49 other states. When we know there is so much need from low-income families for food assistance and other, just basic living needs, it is really hard to carve up the money and do it in a way that is responsible, but also meeting at least as much of those needs as we can during this moment with the limited funding that we have. I certainly respect that Colorado voters passed Tabor, that many 30 years ago. Tabor continues to limit the amount of investments we can make in our public schools, our colleges, our universities, and all those other programs we want to fund. So it is challenging to have to choose when there are so many needs and so many priorities.
I couldn't have said it better. Rep. McCluskie and I think, are very much aligned in our values and our priorities and the things that we personally care about. And so personally, I very much struggled this year with the recognition that I wanted to make progress in K-12 education, but by doing so, it impacted our ability to make progress in higher education. There is a real push-pull between those two. K-12 education is protected constitutionally through Amendment 23, and so it's a little bit more mandatory than higher education. And so when we feel budget pressures, there are very few places to go within the budget to be able to reduce spending that doesn't have a huge impact to K-12 education, because it makes up the majority of our budget. So we could have in 2020, this is an interesting statistic, we could have eliminated the general fund component or the state component of funding for 12 of our departments in Colorado, and it would not have even totaled $500 million. So we needed to cut $3.3 billion from our budget in 2020, and we could have zeroed out, wiped out 12 departments of our state funding in that year, and it wouldn't even gotten us to a quarter of the way of what we needed to cut. So it's really difficult when we have to balance priorities, and higher education, quite frankly, is at a bigger risk because it is not mandatory. We don't have the same kinds of constitutional protections around higher education funding, and so it's really challenging. Because we just know how important it is to have a good, well-qualified workforce. We also know the impacts of that on our economy. And ultimately, we know the great value of post-secondary education to earning a good living, a sustainable living. And so we want to make progress in those areas, and we want to be able to increase access and enrollment to our institutions of higher education. We want to be able to work on addressing the high cost of higher education. At this point, our students are carrying so much student loan debt. We know that has some real problems just generally in life. So it's very frustrating to have to cut one side of education in order to support the other side of education. And that's really the place that we found ourselves this year, was having to make that difficult choice of choosing between one or the other. And when in my mind, I want to do both. So for me, that was probably the most difficult. I will also say another real big challenge that we had this year is that we heard from Coloradans all across the state that they had a priority around affordable housing, that they really wanted the legislature to address affordable housing, which is very difficult to do within the state budget and from a statewide perspective. For many years, those types of issues are addressed locally. But the problem around affordable housing has just exceeded that category of local programming to a level where we really do need to take statewide intervention. We need to do something as a state to be able to impact affordable housing. So we heard that and we decided that because so much of those issues were connected to the pandemic, not to say that we didn't have them before, but they were magnified by the pandemic, we decided to use a large chunk of our federal one-time dollars to address the affordable housing crisis. And then secondly, we are hoping to make some policy changes that will continue beyond the one-time funding allocations that we are making for affordable housing, so that we can better partner with our local communities to address those very real concerns around not being able to afford to live in this amazing state anymore.
Well, thank you so much, because I'm not on joint budget committee, but from the outside looking in, I just know how hard you all are working. And so that was personally, just a question that I had. So thank you for answering that. It's fascinating. There is another question in the chat about ARPA housing bills. So the original intending of the ARPA funding was to help the most vulnerable who are most impacted by the pandemic. Specifically, how are the ARPA housing bills addressing this? And I'll just plug really quick for Kathy. I actually had a whole section in my newsletter addressing, I think I put a number of bills in there. So I'm gonna drop those in the chat for you because there are quite a few, but then I will also turn it over to either of you for any other specific answers.
Senator Zenzinger, I know that you are deeply involved in the ARPA housing conversations.
I am.
Probably have the best update.
So these conversations around the ARPA dollars were central to our budget process, in that we were trying to figure out, what do we want to prioritize with the American Rescue Plan Act dollars? So the acronym ARPA comes from the American Rescue Plan Act, which were federal dollars that were distributed to the states to recover and to address the pandemic and the impacts of the pandemic. And so from a state budgeting perspective, we wanted to make sure that we were focusing those dollars in the best possible way. And we also had to think about how those federal dollars would impact our state dollars, because we do have Tabor in the state. So the majority of those dollars did not actually run through the state budget. For example, some of the majority of the ARPA dollars for higher education, for example, did not come to the state budget. The majority of the dollars for K-12 education did not run through the state budget either. They went directly to the institutions. They went directly to the schools and the school districts. Some of the healthcare dollars, for example, ran through the state budget and some did not. So we needed to try and figure out what was already being covered that was not running through our state budget, and then how could our state budget supplement those areas that did not receive those direct distributions. We did do a statewide listening tour, and the three primary areas that the state wanted us to look at investing those dollars was behavioral health and mental health, housing, and recovery efforts, that were related to the economy. And so that's what we chose to do with the majority of those dollars. When we put together the recommendation for housing specifically, and I'm going to put in the chat right now the final report that we are using the recommendations from that final report from the housing task force that we put together to put together the bills that are now supporting those recommendations. If you have an opportunity to copy that link that I put in the chat and just kind of peruse through that final report, you'll notice that we called out the connection to those communities that were most impacted throughout all of the recommendations. So that was front and center. It guided our decision making. It guided how we will prioritize the funding. It'll guide how we prioritize the projects that ultimately get funded. Those communities that were impacted the most were front and center in all of our conversations. But then secondly, as I stated earlier, it's not to say that we didn't have a housing crisis before the pandemic. It's not to say that we didn't have a behavioral health crisis before the pandemic. The pandemic just exaggerated those fault lines that were already there. It just exposed some of these problems that were under the surface in a new way and really helped to highlight our challenges and just that we needed to do something about these immediately. However, I will call out that the funding that we received from the federal government is one-time dollars. So that was another part of our budget conversations, was just trying to figure out that balance between one-time dollars and ongoing spending. We would love to make all of the things that we are doing with our one-time dollars permanent and forever, but our state budget is not actually able to carry that going forward. So we had to really look at the balance between those two and figure out what could we invest in right now that we could continue on after the one-time dollars are spent, and what could we just knock out with those one-time dollars that would not require an ongoing appropriation. So that's how we did that. I wanted to ask Rep. McCluskie if you could talk a little bit about something that was in your presentation that kind of speaks to this, which are those prepays. There was a line in there that we are setting aside a certain portion of our budget to address those prepays. And maybe you could talk about what those are and how it's connected to this.
Sure. We had both prepays and placeholders in the budget, and I'll talk about both. Again, thinking about the impacts of the global pandemic and the economic impacts that it had for our state, we are very committed to being sure we have dollars in our piggy bank for any future downturn. So we have that 15% general fund reserve. We've also put money into prepaying some of our future obligations so that we are ready for those when they hit in future years, beyond even next year's budget. So this includes our para obligation. We've put money aside to make sure that we have funding to cover para in future years. Some of our controlled maintenance on our facilities and capital projects, we've put money aside for that. We've also put what we call a placeholder into the budget. This for one-time state general fund dollars, not the American Rescue Plan dollars, not the federal funding, but state money that we realized because we had made those reductions in 2020. Colorado's economy bounced back quicker. So we ended up with money coming into the state that we had not anticipated. Our forecast for general fund revenues just didn't anticipate that we would come back as strong as we did. So we've been able to capture those one-time dollars and put them aside to help complement some of these housing proposals that are coming from the interim task force. complement some of the behavioral and mental health needs that came out of the task force as well, and then make some investments in those areas that Coloradans have told us are a priority, whether that's helping to bring down fees, providing fee relief to help save Coloradans money, maybe making investments in public safety. We know there are concerns about rising crime. We want to make sure that we're tackling that head on. So we've put money aside to address that, money into more workforce development, and certainly the air quality challenges that our state is facing. We are about to be downgraded by the federal government from serious to severe in our air quality, and that will require that we make more investments both in inspections of stationary sources and trying to drive a reduction in air quality issues with mobile sources. So there is a lot ahead for the budget, even though we have a proposal to bring forward to the House and the Senate. We have put aside quite a bit of money to let our colleagues really prioritize what is most important for the state, listen, of course, to constituents, and better understand how we can tackle some of those priorities.
Rep. McCluskie, we had a question that was in the chat, not in the Q&A, around the healthcare summit that took place this last week that Kim Bimsteffer, the executive director of HCPF, the Healthcare Policy and Financing Division, led. And in that healthcare summit, and this might be an unfair question because this is kind of straying a little bit away from the budget, so we may not, I certainly don't know the answer, and you may not know the answer, but it's been my experience that Rep. McCluskie absolutely knows pretty much everything about everything. So I think you probably will know, but the question that was asked is, in the summit this week, they mentioned taking away specialist visits from Medicaid and placing that burden on PCPs to save money. The question is, what protections are in place to reserve our right to see qualified doctors for our medically complex community? And I don't have the answer to that, and I'm hoping that maybe you know a little bit more.
I will say up front, I wasn't at the healthcare summit, and I don't want to misspeak or misrepresent anything that Director Bimsteffer might have discussed. This might be in relationship to something that we've been talking about on the budget committee, and we do plan to fund in kind of a starter way, and that's an alternative payment method, an APM for primary care. And the idea is, if we help kind of reshape how primary care is both delivered and prioritized in the state, helping our primary care providers, encouraging them to be more engaged with their patients, providing more prevention and wellness care early on, the state ends up saving money if they don't have to refer their patients onto more serious or specialized care. Now, I don't believe the APM is designed to tell people they can't see specialists. I don't think that is what this effort is about. This effort is about putting money upfront into primary care so that we can save money on the back end when people need the type of care that comes from maybe not having access early on to getting their health taken care of before it becomes serious. I'd be happy to follow up with Director Bimsteffer, because if it wasn't related to that model, I'm not sure what she might have been referring to.
Great. So I see there are a few more questions in the chat or in the Q&A function. The next question is about air quality. And the question is, can you restate the level of air quality we are going to?
Sure, and I would be happy, I can take just a minute to search for the brief that we received in the Joint Budget Committee. You know, Colorado's air quality has continued to deteriorate over the past many years, really. And so I believe the downgrade is from serious to severe. And with that downgrade will come additional requirements from the federal government in what the state is doing to improve air quality. There was a bill passed last year. I believe it was 1266 or 1226, might have that number wrong. But there was funding put into some of the regulatory processes, as well as a focus on disadvantaged communities, lower income communities, making sure that there is environmental justice, a focus on environmental justice, and that we aren't allowing refineries or other stationary sources that are causing part of our air quality problems to pollute the air at a rate that adversely impacts those communities. So I will look real quickly and try to post this in the chat for everyone, but it does provide what I think is a pretty good plan to tackle air quality challenges and how the state will move forward to address it.
And Rep. McCluskie, you had listed that as one of the big things that we funded this year. Was a big part of our conversations was the air quality package. And one of the challenges that we had with that is the governor made it a priority in his budget requests. The legislature also made it a priority through several of their legislative bills. So we've been working together, both the governor's budget team as well as with the legislature, to figure out how we can combine our proposals so that they complement each other instead of compete with each other. For a little while there, it looked like they were going to be competing for the same dollars, and we didn't want that. So we worked in coordination with one another to make sure that both the governor could receive the level of funding that he thinks his department needs, the CDPHE, the Colorado Department of Health and Environment, to address these air quality challenges, coupled with legislators that have prioritized making progress on climate change and on air quality. And we just needed to find a way in order to combine these two goals together so that we could put together what we believe is going to be a pretty good air quality package as part of the overall budget. I will tell you, I really struggled with it because there was a proposal for 179 new full-time employees, for example. And if we were to do that, that would mean that we would not be able to make as much progress on the budget stabilization factor in education. So this is an example of those competing priorities that we're trying to do both in our budget, but we just don't have the capacity to do both. But it's important enough to us that we decided to really prioritize climate and air quality this year within our budget, and to support the efforts of our fellow legislators that are carrying legislation this year.
All right,
So we have,
Sorry,
we just have a few more minutes. We are going to wrap up with the presentation in enough time to do some introductions of elected officials and candidates that have joined us. But we will go ahead and address Barb Stevens' question. And then I'm going to use Obi's question as our way of transitioning to our elected officials, because Obi is one of our Westminster City Councilors. So we'll kick things off with Barb Stevens. She says, speaking of air quality, what are we doing to encourage more use of public transportation by more of us, especially as we baby boomers age, and you don't want us driving as we get worse at driving, and just getting everyone to want to use public transport. And Rep. McCluskie, I don't know if you want to address this. I'm not really sure that we address that from a budget perspective, but you might be aware of some other initiatives in the hopper that are related.
I don't know that I am specifically, but happy to do a little bit of research and ask our staff about the topic as well.
You know what? I will also do the same. So take that off your plate. Rep. McCluskie is going to be shepherding the budget through the process next week. And so I do know that our staff are working really hard on preparing the budget summary and the budget document for introduction on Monday. So I will take that on, Barb, and I will look a little bit at maybe some legislation that is working its way through the process. I will say that I am aware of an ERTIF project. ERTIF is an acronym for Economic Recovery and something. I don't remember, Rep. McCluskie, what the, it was something for the
Economic Recovery and Relief Task Force.
There we go. So one of the task forces that was up and running this summer, in addition to the behavioral health and in addition to the housing task forces, is we had our Economic Recovery and Relief Task Force that came up with ideas for the one-time dollars. And one of the bills that I believe prioritizes some of that money is a bill that Senator Winter is carrying around free transit days. In particular, in the days where we tend to have the poorest air quality, which is August. That's the month that we tend to have our red days, our red alerts, where it's really important that we use public transit and try to consolidate our trips and take advantage of those types of options. And this bill will actually provide free transit passes during that month. I believe it's a $22 million investment that we're looking to do in order to encourage transit riding. One of the challenges that we have had is that Rep. McCluskie is a good example of this. She doesn't live in the metro area. She lives up in the mountain communities. And then we have, people all over the state, Western Slope, Front Range, and the Eastern Plains. And we wanted to make sure that we were equitable with those relief dollars, that we weren't just throwing all of the dollars towards the metro area. And so this is one of those projects, $22 million for the RTD to provide free transit, was very metro-centric, right? Not to say that we don't need it or that we don't want it, but we just needed to make sure that we weren't doing too much of that, that we were trying to spread those dollars around so that we are hitting all of the communities in Colorado that were impacted by the pandemic, because we were impacted in different ways. And so that was one of the projects that was prioritized, however, by the legislature. And so we will be moving forward with it, but that's just one of them. We had another question come in after OBs from Maureen Welch says, thank you for working on special education funding. We have to get resources, so funding isn't a barrier for teaching complex disabilities like my son. Thank you. And I agree. That is one of my passions. So we're going to wrap things up here with our presentation before we move on to Obi's question. And so I just want to say thank you so much to Rep. McCluskie for joining us today, for presenting all of the information on the budget. You are an impeccable spokesperson for the budget and for our state. And it's a real pleasure working alongside you on the budget. And we just really, really, truly appreciate your time today. Part of the reason why this is virtual online is because we were not going to be able to have Rep. McCluskie join us if we were in person. And we were like, no, that's a line too far. We have to have Rep. McCluskie. So we're really thankful that you were able to join us today.
I am delighted to have had this conversation and time with everyone, and to everybody who is still on the town hall. You have amazing leaders here in Senator Zenzinger, Representative Doherty, and Representative Titone. It is such a privilege to work with them, to be their partner in the good work that they are doing for their constituents in this state. And I really look forward to the rest of session, being colleagues and doing good things. So take care, everyone. Thanks for having me today.
You're on mute.
I am. We just have a couple of folks that are joining with us, and hopefully I was able to capture all of them. We have Mary Parker with our Jeffco School Board who is with us. We have a candidate who is with us today, Reggie Marinelli, who is running for sheriff for Jefferson County. And then lastly, I do believe we have Obi Azadi is with us, and I'm wondering if we might be able to promote Obi as a panelist so that Obi can give us a quick update on what's happening in the city of Westminster. And while we are working on that, I will address Obi's question. Councilmember Izadi asked about whether or not the ARPA funds could be used for infrastructure projects such as water, because we all know that that's an important topic, in particular in Westminster. Not directly through the revolving loan program, because that is very specific to new construction for housing. We did talk about a couple of policy changes that would allow us to cover the local tap fees that construction and other types of housing authorities must pay when they do construct new housing. Some of those tap fees are expensive and impede their ability to secure financing to be able to offer a type of housing that would be affordable for the workforce. So not specifically. However, water is a huge topic, and I will mention that we are devoting almost $100 million of those Rescue Plan Act funds towards water rights in the state, to secure water rights so that we can maintain water security in the future, especially given the problems that we are having with climate change and drought. So this is the first time our state has ever dedicated that much money towards water type of projects. Unfortunately, the majority of that is not here in the Front Range basins. It's in our agricultural spaces down in the San Luis Valley and on the Western Slope. So it'll still help, but it will be specific to the metro area. So welcome, Councilmember Izadi, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I was just texting Representative Doherty. I was running on the trail this whole time, and listening to this was better than music. So that this is a fantastic opportunity to keep me going on the trail. So thanks for having me. In Westminster, what's going on now is we're searching for a city manager. So that's still ongoing. We are still analyzing the Semper water treatment plant. It's a plant that is in dire need of repair. So we're searching for funding and trying to figure out what to do with it, with that plant. So that's why I asked that question. So thanks for that response. We're also talking through homelessness. That's a big issue. As we all know, affordable housing is impacting every city and every state almost. I just came from the National League of Cities last week, where I met with a lot of councilors and mayors, and they all spoke to how homelessness is a big issue. So in Westminster, we're facing that right now. So it was good to hear about what the Affordable Housing Task Force is doing. And I'm very curious as to how that continues to progress. Yeah, but those are the biggest issues right now. And just wanted to thank you all again for this amazing presentation. I learned a lot about the budget today.
Great, thanks so much for, I'm glad the timing worked out and looks like you're done with your run. So thanks for the update on Westminster.
And the ice bath too.
Glad we could entertain you. So anyway, just wanted to say thank you so much for everyone for joining today. I think that was such a great, I learned a lot, especially from Senator Zenzinger and our guest, Rep. McCluskie, about the budget, and I look forward to going through budget week. And I believe we put our information in the chat So you can sign up for all of our newsletters or get in touch with us if you would like to. We'd love to hear from you, and we will give you details about our next town hall soon. So with that, everyone enjoy their beautiful Colorado weekend. Thanks so much.